so serious about the protest movement, just there, but they were so flippant that they were singing a happy-go-lucky song, which happens to be one I wrote, and I'm glad they sang it, and when I get there, I'll sing it with them. When I get in. John Lennon of the Beatles was not only a creative genius and a symbol of peace, but also a deeply complex soul haunted by wounds and inner turmoil. After his sudden death at the age of 40, a secret notebook was discovered. Inside was a list of names Lennon despised during his lifetime. The revelations shocked many. Among them were towering musical icons, a lifelong friend who had betrayed him, and most shocking of all, the name of the man at the very top of Washington's power structure, the one who had dragged Lennon into a brutal legal battle. Who were they? And why did John Lennon keep this list hidden until the day he died? John Lennon was one of those rare figures whose childhood and entire life were marked by contradictions, tragedies, and paradoxes. Born in 1940 in the port city of Liverpool, right amid World War II. His childhood was overshadowed by the sound of falling bombs, insecurity, and scarcity. His parents separated early, leaving John to live with his Aunt Mimi. His mother, Julia, still visited often, though she did not raise him directly. It was Julia who placed a banjo in her son's hands, planting the very first seed of his love for music. But tragedy struck far too soon. In 1958, when John was just 17, his mother was suddenly killed in a car accident right outside her home. The shock left a scar so deep it never truly healed. Later songs such as Julia and Mother would become his anguished cries, a son mourning a mother he could never have back. As a boy, Lennon was known for being rebellious, often getting into fights and being criticized by his teachers. Yet in art and music, he displayed undeniable natural talent. In 1956, Lennon founded the skiffle band The Quarrymen, where he met Paul McCartney and later George Harrison. The Lennon-McCartney partnership grew into one of the greatest songwriting duos in history, propelling the Beatles to become the most iconic band the world had ever seen. Within the Beatles, Lennon was both the rebellious spirit and the lightning rod for controversy. He left an indelible mark with timeless songs like Help All You Need Is Love and Come Together. Yet behind the glory, Lennon often felt trapped by fame, haunted by the losses of his childhood, and frequently made headlines for his provocative, sometimes shocking remarks. Then came the final tragedy. On the night of December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot dead outside the Dakota Building in New York. He was only 40 years old, far too young for a talent of his magnitude. News of his death spread instantly across the globe. Strangers wept openly on the streets upon hearing the devastating announcement. In life, John Lennon was celebrated as a symbol of peace and the yearning for freedom, but he was also a man riddled with contradictions. After his death, a secret notebook was discovered in which Lennon candidly listed people he disliked, even some of his most famous contemporaries. It revealed the duality of Lennon, both great and flawed, a boundless creative soul, yet burdened with pain and inner conflict. Perhaps it was precisely these tragedies and contradictions that shaped John Lennon, not just as a songwriter, but as an artist who defined an entire era. 1. Elvis Presley, the commercial icon who lost his rebellious spirit. In Liverpool in the 1950s, a young John Lennon sat in his room captivated by the sound of his radio. It wasn't classical music, but the voice of Elvis Presley, the young man with the bold hip-shaking, a challenge to the conservative American society of the time. In interviews, Lennon admitted, "Before Elvis, there was nothing." It was Elvis's rebellious and free spirit that gave Lennon the courage to pick up a guitar and form the Quarrymen, the precursor to the Beatles. At that time, in Lennon's eyes, Elvis Presley was an untouchable god. As time passed, the youthful dream became a reality. On August 27, 1965, the Beatles, by then world famous, were scheduled to meet Elvis at his Beverly Hills mansion. Lennon was ecstatic. However, his excitement quickly turned to disappointment. The person sitting in front of them was no longer the rebel of old, but a detached, safe Hollywood star, his eyes glued to the television, making the atmosphere dull and awkward. Later, Lennon recalled that Elvis had lost his fire. In the 1970s, he publicly criticized Elvis died when he joined the army. Better, Lennon believed that in 1958, when Presley abandoned his wild image to adopt a tame persona that suited the conservative American market, he became nothing more than a commercial machine, even a product fully exploited by the U.S. government. The peak of Lennon's disappointment came in 1970 when the press published a photo of a smiling Elvis shaking hands with President Nixon. To Lennon, who was passionately protesting the war, that image was nothing short of a betrayal. In later conversations, Lennon mockingly called Elvis a reflection of surrender to the system. In John Lennon's heart, there existed two images of Elvis Presley: a king who paved the way for the rock explosion and inspired a boy in Liverpool to dream, and a person who later voluntarily cast off his rebellious spirit to stand alongside the government. Therefore, Lennon felt both pain and anger, because Elvis was the one who opened the door to rock for him, but in the end, he was also the one who slammed it shut by compromising with the very people Lennon despised. But if Lennon's disappointment with Elvis stemmed from an idol who became a commercial symbol, the next tragedy was far more bitter. This time, the person who hurt him was the one who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him, helping him write the Beatles' legend. 2. Paul McCartney. From soulmate to sworn enemy. Paul McCartney, on what it was like for him after the Beatles broke up and who it was who kept him going. We're talking about the business of the Beatles. And this, to me, is fascinating. When they break up, all right? And who knows who broke, everyone has a theory. I know. Who broke it up? John did. You were young guys. You needed to go off on your own. And he'd found, as you say, Yoko, his muse. John Lennon and Paul McCartney weren't just bandmates. They were soulmates. A series of the Beatles' timeless songs were born from their synergy. The whole world knew that Lennon and McCartney were two halves that complemented each other, creating an almost inseparable whole. However, by the late 1960s, the first cracks appeared. During the recording of the album Let It Be 1969, Paul increasingly took control of the studio. He constantly asked the members to repeat takes or follow his directions. Lennon felt constrained, mockingly calling Paul the schoolmaster. The tension was evident in documentary footage. George Harrison coldly replied to Paul, "I'll play whatever you want me to play," or "I won't play at all if you don't want me to." The suffocating atmosphere foreshadowed a storm. That storm truly erupted in December 1970 when Paul McCartney filed a lawsuit against the other three members to dissolve the company Apple Corps and escape the management of Alan Klein. For John, George, and Ringo, this was nothing short of betrayal. The lawsuit officially put an end to the Beatles and turned the Lennon-McCartney friendship into a public war. John Lennon couldn't hide his anger. In the album Imagine 1971, he released the song How Do You Sleep, a direct attack on Paul. The song contains many sarcastic lines like, "The sound you make is music to my ears. You must have learned something in all those years, and the only thing you've done is yesterday. And since you've gone, you're just another day." Paul's pain was compounded when George Harrison, who he considered a friend, contributed the slide guitar to that very satirical track. Not stopping at music, Lennon also attacked Paul in the media. In an interview with Rolling Stone 1971, he called Paul a mediocre musician who only knew how to write easy-listening pop. He publicly criticized Paul's solo album Ram as rubbish, and even implied that Paul was plagiarizing and riding on the Beatles' fame. Despite the wreckage, there were still some glimmers of light. In the mid-1970s, Lennon and McCartney met again, and even had an impromptu jam session in New York 1974. But they never officially reunited and didn't have a chance to fully reconcile. On December 8, 1980, when a gunshot took John Lennon's life outside the Dakota Building, Paul McCartney lost not just an old bandmate, but a part of his soul. For years afterward, Paul would tear up when talking about John, calling him his greatest friend and brother, even though their friendship had been stained with bitterness. If the conflict between Lennon and McCartney was bitter enough, the real catalyst that blew up the Beatles was not just about music. Behind Paul, a powerful family was